This is Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi. Here now, Tony Bruschi.
From the outside, the Delphi case always looked deceptively simple. Two young girls vanish on a February afternoon. A grainy image from a cell phone captures a man walking on a bridge. A muffled voice says, "Down the hill." That's really what it sounds like. And for years, investigators insist they are closing in. People assume the machinery is working, the process is functioning, that somewhere behind the curtain are meticulous detectives mapping timelines, comparing evidence, and pulling threads until the truth emerges. People want to believe that. People need to believe that, because the alternative, the possibility that an investigation of this magnitude is not just flawed but fractured, is almost too unsettling to consider. But the depositions kind of rip the curtain away. And once you read them, once you sit with the contradictions, once you hear investigators contradicting each other, contradicting themselves, contradicting the very documents they wrote and swore by, once you understand how much was withheld, how much was minimized, how much was simply ignored, you realize something no one in authority ever wanted to admit. This case wasn't just complicated. It was compromised. And not necessarily through corruption, not through conspiracy, but through something far more common and far more dangerous than the criminal justice system. A chaotic, disorganized, internally conflicted investigation that never found its grounding. It begins with the agencies themselves, the Indiana State Police, the Carroll County Sheriff's Office, the FBI, three different power structures, three different cultures, and three different timelines, and three versions of reality. We're the aristocrats. One of the lead investigators swore under oath that Superintendent Doug Carter personally kicked the FBI out of the Delphi investigation. Not a polite thank you for your service, not a routine scaling back. He said Carter shut the Bureau out of the room. A federal agency, one of the most experienced investigative entities in violent crimes, removed from a double homicide investigation of two children. That should have been front page news. Instead, it wasn't mentioned publicly at all. It wasn't acknowledged in press conferences. It wasn't reflected in statements. It was buried inside a deposition until the defense unearthed it. And then, unbelievably, another investigator, someone who worked hand in hand with the first, denied it ever happened. Said he had no knowledge of the FBI being removed. Said Carter had nothing to do with that decision. The two testimonies cannot coexist in the same universe. One is true or neither is. But they can't both be. And that theme, internal contradiction, repeats through every corner of this good old boy case. Take the behavioral analysis unit. In most states, in most investigations, when the behavioral analysis unit weighs in, people listen. It's not gospel, but it is significant. They've profiled serial killers, ritual killers, spree killers, lone offenders, group offenders. They've identified patterns in scenes most investigators have never encountered. And when they examined Delphi early on, they reported a conclusion that was stunning. Indicators of Nordic belief systems, Odinism, ritualistic staging, symbolic elements. It is, without question, one of the most consequential assessments made in this entire investigation. And yet investigators barely remember it. One says he doesn't recall the behavioral analysis unit of the FBI giving that opinion. Another seems to recall something, but not enough to give details. No one memorialized it in an official report. No one documented how much weight it carried. No one followed up. No one seems to know why such a major conclusion was essentially erased from the internal record of the case. Just a... Then 6 years after the murders, a small-town assistant police chief in Rushville, someone not even assigned to Carroll County, writes a memo outlining odinous suspects, symbolic parallels, runic patterns, blood correspondence, social media connections, and in that memo he references the Behavioral Analysis Unit assessment. It survived only because he wrote it down, not because anyone at the top of the investigation treated it as important. And once the internal chaos became clear, the timeline, the supposed backbone of this case, starts to fall apart under its own weight. Investigators presented the timeline as definitive. Abby and Livia arrive at the trail around a certain time. A man is spotted around a certain time. Witnesses place him nearing the bridge. And all of it leads, they say, to one logical conclusion. Richard Allen was there. He was the man on the bridge. He encountered the girls. He committed the murders. Except when you actually go back to the actual witness statements, not the summaries, not the press releases, not the affidavits, the deposition testimony, it reveals something else entirely. There is a witness who saw a man and a vehicle that day. She described the man as young, early 20s, poofy hair, not a grown man in his 40s. She described the car as older, something from the 60s, a Ford Comet-style body, boxy, angular, absolutely not a black Ford Focus. She told investigators this twice, yet the search warrant affidavit drafted by Sheriff Tony Liggett, sworn to be truthful, claims her statement was consistent with Allen. That's not at all what she said. The affidavit admits her description entirely. It does not mention her saying the vehicle looked nothing like Allen's. It does not mention her stating the man looked far younger. It doesn't mention the hair, the build, the age, nothing. And it has nothing to do with being consistent unless you don't know what the word consistent means. The affidavit simply transforms her into a witness who supports the theory they had already committed to without giving any sort of backdrop. Yeah, she's on the same page too. What'd she say? Similar things. What exactly did she say? You don't need to know. It's not a small error. This isn't a misremembered detail. This is the altering of meaning of a witness statement to justify a search. And when a judge signs off on a warrant based on an altered meaning, every piece of evidence it follows becomes legally and ethically vulnerable. The same thing happened with another witness. Surprise, surprise. One statement was framed in a way that suggested Allen had more time than he did. Another was paraphrased to imply a sighting that never fully matched. Crucial context was missing. And for all the talk investigators have done publicly about how thorough every lead was vetted, the third-party suspects, the two men the defense argues were connected both symbolically and physically to the crime, were barely touched. One of them, after being interviewed, after having his DNA taken, turned back towards the trooper who just questioned him and asked whether he'd be in trouble if his spit were found on one of the girls. If you're... just think of that for a second. Why would your spit be found on a body of a young girl? More importantly, why are you spitting on the body of a young girl? And if you had nothing to do with this, why would your first move not to be call 911? There's a dead girl here, not, I think I got a loogie. Not weird or suspicious or anything. That's the kind of statement that in any competent investigation would generate urgency, follow-up, search warrant, surveillance, something. But in this case, they dropped it, classified as no further leads. The investigative equivalent of a shrug. The other man connected through social media to Odinist symbolism, to images that disturbingly resembled the actual crime scene, to memes about helping move a body 3 days after the murders, to a .40 caliber handgun that investigators never once seized or tested, was also dismissed as no further leads. And here is where the contradictions get even more dramatic. Investigators have insisted for years that this was a lone wolf attack, a single man acting alone in the woods, but inside the depositions, the cracks show again. One investigator says one offender, another says multiple offenders seem likely based on the complexity of the scene, the staging, the arrangement, the distance bodies were carried, the absence of drag marks, the time window, the terrain. But even that internal disagreement isn't the real problem. The problem is how little physical evidence was collected to resolve those differences. The sticks placed on the girls' bodies, a visual centerpiece of the crime scene, were left untouched for days, not hours. Days. In any properly handled homicide, those items would be photographed, documented, collected, analyzed, cataloged, matched for origin, tested for DNA, examined for symbolic patterns. Here, they weren't even removed on day one. No one measured them. No one diagrammed them. No one tried to determine whether they were moved, placed, arranged, ritualistic. And when a blood spatter expert was finally brought in 7 years after the murders, the job he was asked to do was not examine the crime scene, it was to look at the photographs. Keep in mind, 7 years later. The bullet is perhaps the most troubling example, the single unspent round that prosecutors relied on to argue that Allen's gun had been racked with force at the scene, leaving behind a casing that matched his Sig Sauer. This piece of evidence was foundational in the state's argument that Allen's gun was present and functional during the murders. And what documentation exists of the bullet at the scene? None. A photograph of it lying where it was found. No image of the investigators picking it up, no record of the evidence technician who bagged it, nothing, only photos of the bullet inside a lab after it arrived from the scene, a crucial piece with evidence, with an invisible origin. A defense attorney presented a piece of evidence with that level of documentation, or if one did, the state would tear them apart. They'd call the evidence unreliable, questionable, compromised. But here, because the state possessed it, because it fit the narrative, the lack of documentation became an inconvenience rather than a problem. Remember, this is a case where they've been very good at making evidence disappear. And oops, all those interviews with all those potential suspects within the first 48, 24, 72 hours, we accidentally taped over them with reruns of Golden Girls. And in the background of all of this is the discovery timeline, a timeline that when viewed through the depositions looks less like a mistake and more like a systematic failure. In May of 23, the Rushville assistant chief sent a letter to the prosecutor's office. Attached were 85 pages of Odinist suspect research, interviews, digital files, symbolic interpretations, connections, dates, imagery, and references to the behavioral analysis unit's analysis. Materials that any competent investigator would want, and that any defense team is legally entitled to. Material that could support alternative suspects. Material that complicates the lone offender narrative the state was married to. The prosecutor did not hand this over immediately. Not in June, not in July, not in August. The defense received this potentially exculpatory package in September. 4 months later, after multiple court hearings and discovery battles. Meanwhile, pre-trial rulings were being made by a judge who did not have the full picture. Evidence was being barred before it was even seen. Experts were being blocked before being heard. And because the defense didn't yet have the odinist evidence, they couldn't effectively argue why it mattered. This isn't a procedural misstep. This is a failure that cuts directly to due process. And yet when investigators were asked under oath while certain leads why they were closed, why certain decisions were made, the answers were vague. They talked about lack of follow-up, no further leads, nothing substantial. They spoke as though these decisions were obvious, self-explanatory. But when you line their statements up with the evidence they ignored, the contradictions become unavoidable. One example, investigators have repeatedly claimed there was no drag marks on the ground, suggesting the bodies were carried. But that alone raises enormous questions. Carried by whom? One investigator suggested one person, another said multiple are more likely, another insisted one offender again. The bodies were heavy, the terrain uneven, the distance meaningful, and the forensic evidence, what little exists, doesn't resolve the dispute. Another, the sticks placed on the girls' bodies. One investigator testifies they were for concealment. Another suggests it was camouflage. Then a prosecutor at trial floats the idea of an undoing, a psychological concept that investigators never previously invoked. This was the prosecution's own idea. And yet, when the defense argued that this opened the door to discussing alternative symbolic meanings, including odinist interpretations, the judge slammed that door shut. Oh, you're going to say weird things in trial like, this is an undoing. That sounds rather Odinisty to me. That kind of sounds like you're going down that road with an undoing of sticks. So what were you doing? What? Only they can use the terms. You can't. We're just going to make it sound really weird over here, but then you can't say shit. This is a pattern. And the depositions are the roadmap. The deeper you go, the more chaotic the entire investigative process becomes. It looks reactive rather than proactive. It looks like an investigation that never stabilized and never locked in its internal logic, that changed direction whenever pressure increased, and that ultimately settled on a suspect because they needed one, not because the evidence demanded one. There are moments in the depositions where investigators refer to their own decisions as unclear, where they admit they don't recall major events, where they acknowledge that important leads were sidelined without full investigation, where they contradict themselves on issues as basic as what happened to the FBI. Did you fire him? I thought you fired him. Who fired him? I didn't fire him. Here's the most important part. This isn't about the defense making accusations. These contradictions come straight from the people who led the case. These gaps come from their own mouths. The inconsistencies aren't a narrative being imposed. They are the narrative revealed through sworn statements. And when you take it all together, the BAU's early conclusion, the internal conflict about the FBI's role, the manipulated witness statements, the discarded third-party suspects, the symbolic indicators, the poor evidence collection, the bullet documentation gaps, the late discovery disclosures, the contradictions about lone versus multiple offenders, the selective emphasis on some evidence and neglect of other evidence, you're kind of left with an investigation that doesn't point cleanly to any truth. It points to uncertainty. It points to inconsistency. It points to a fractured process. And that fractured process is why Richard Allen will now be judged by on appeal. It's what the appellate court will have to weigh. It's what will determine whether this conviction stands, on whether an entirely new phase of this case is about to begin. And it's what leaves the community in Delphi, and frankly the entire country, with a question no one wants to face, but everyone now has to confront. What if this case wasn't solved? What if the wrong questions were asked? What if the right questions were ignored? What if the evidence collected wasn't the evidence needed, or evidence at all? What if the truth was always there, but the investigation wasn't structured to find it? What if the real story of Delphi isn't just what happened to Abby and Libby, but what happened to the investigation meant to bring them justice? Because the depositions don't lie, the records don't lie, the contradictions don't lie, the missing pieces don't lie, the delayed disclosures don't lie. Someone, somewhere, at some point, will have to face the fact that the architecture of this investigation is not what it has been presented to be. And when that reckoning comes, when it happens in appellate court or federal court or public opinion, it's going to shake everything. And hopefully then, it won't be too late, and Richard Allen can actually get a fair trial. Give me your thoughts in the comments section on YouTube. If you're not already there, search Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi. We'd love to have you, and please let me know your thoughts on this case. We're trying to get up to 100,000 subscribers by the end of the year. We're getting closer. We're a bit over 81,000 as of this second. Maybe we can do it. If you don't mind, hit subscribe on YouTube. We'd really appreciate that. Until next time, I'm Tony Bruschi. We'll talk again real soon.
Want more on this case and others? Then press subscribe now and don't miss a moment of true crime coverage from Tony Bruschi and the Hidden Killers podcast.